Well, they can't all be winners. It's an exercise in well-intended failure on NES Works episode 96.
Ho, 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 Vern. Very...
By the end of 1988, the NES had absolutely become a haven for groundbreaking game design that pushed forward the state-of-the-art every bit as much as you saw in the Atari 2600's heyday. But folks, let me be honest here, not every one of those efforts nailed it. By and large, I would say NES game design broke down along three different categories. You had your genuine masterworks, games created by developers with a strong creative vision and the technical chops to realize those ambitions. You had your cash-ins by companies who recognized the NES as a fertile ground for profits, but didn't invest the time or resources to come up with good design, or take the opportunity to hone their craft. And then you have games like Dr. Chaos and Superman, which contained big, ambitious ideas, attempted to execute on them, and fell flat on their face. This week we have a pair of noble failures. I do not recommend either of these games to anyone, but both try to punch way above their weight class, and you absolutely have to respect the effort. I can't pretend to know what the design document for Dr. Chaos looked like, but if I were to hazard a guess, I would assume it said something to the effect of transplant the still beating heart of the Goonies 2 into the festering body of Super Pitfall. The NES and Famicom library contained a ton of games whose creators clearly patterned them after a popular hit, often quite openly. For Hudson's Adventure Island, Westone set out to create a more challenging and energetic take on Super Mario Bros. The Battle of Olympus's designer looked to Zelda 2 for inspiration. Eight Eyes would never have existed without Castlevania, nor would we have a codename Viper without Rolling Thunder. And don't even get me started on all those Dragon Quest clones. Dr. Chaos may well take the prize for being the game based around the most obscure source material on NES. The Goonies 2 fared reasonably well in the US, I think, but even here it didn't shake the firmament of the platform. It simply went down in history as a fun oddity that created no end of confusion among kids who erroneously believed it was based on an actual second Goonies film and went hunting for it in video stores. Nevertheless, FCI and developer Marionette somehow decided that would be the framework upon which they would base their second release for Famicom Disk System, the first having been KONEKO Monogatari, aka Kitten Story, aka the Japanese version of Milo and Otis. Then again, Dr. Chaos shipped a mere 3 months after the Goonies 2 in Japan, so maybe this is all a bizarre coincidence, and somehow the only two games that attempted to combine action platforming with adventure game exploration in almost exactly the same way just happened to arrive in close proximity to one another. Whatever the case, Dr. Chaos plays like a broken, clumsy version of the Goonies 2. That would be the difference between Konami, already the masters of the NES form, and Marionette, an obscure developer who would go on to make such beloved favorites as Pachinko Time and Card Game for Game Boy. As I alluded to earlier, Dr. Chaos contains the soul of the Goonies 2, but its technical aspects cause it to come off more as a relative of Super Pitfall. It has the kind of choppy frame rate and stilted inconsistency between characters and backgrounds you have come to expect from Micronix games. I can't think of anything that sums up the Dr. Chaos experience better than the experience of pulling too many high-tier enemies onto the screen. It's entirely possible during the action sequences to cause something like half a dozen of the horrible skeleton monsters that inhabit the zone areas to congregate on screen all at once. It's kind of impressive to see so many large monsters on the screen of an NES game at the same time, but two things drag it down. First, they're incredibly ugly. Not in an eldritch horror sense of the word, though that's also true, but more in the sense that they have a crude outsider art appearance. Secondly, the game doesn't seem to contain any programming safeguards to prevent overloading the system, so at a certain point you can lure so many of these creatures onto the screen that the action practically comes to a standstill. If Deadly Towers had been a side-scrolling platformer, it would have been Dr. Chaos. Despite its grievous shortcomings, though, you can see the outline of a really great and compelling game through the haze of failure. For one thing, the NES has yet to come this close to offering a proper horror game. Ninja Kid hinted at it from time to time with some of its yokai and monster movie themed stages, but it never leaned into creepiness the way Dr. Chaos does. Everything here feels uncanny and wrong, despite the fact that real logic dictates the game's workings once you get a sense of how everything fits together. I mean, Dr. Chaos takes place entirely within the confines of a haunted mansion, and the title screen consists of the game's name written in dripping blood. That's a great start. The action begins a lot like the Goonies 2, unsurprisingly enough, with your protagonist, Michael Chaos, stepping into the halls of a creepy house. Doors line the walls of the mansion, and you can duck into any of them to enter what the Goonies 2 would have called an adventure scene. These work almost exactly as they did in that game. You enter a first-person viewpoint in which you can interact with the room through a menu command. These spaces have a more complex structure than those of the Goonies 2, as you can turn to face all 4 cardinal directions rather than simply viewing each room from a single fixed angle. However, I'd argue they work better than the similar scenes in the Goonies 2. They feel more like you're meant to explore these spaces, but you don't have to deal with as many possible command options. The multiple menus and redundant tools of the Goonies 2 compact down to a mere 4 commands: open, get, go, and hit. So you have more space to explore and investigate, but you don't have to cycle through quite so many options, meaning that the process feels far less tedious while requiring more of a mental commitment as you attempt to keep track of your orientation relative to the main mansion interior. Each door leads to a single room, and these rooms can interconnect with one another in the first-person view through both visible doors and also hidden passages that you can reveal by striking certain walls. Understanding this deceptively simple setup allows you to explore more efficiently. If you want to reach a room that appears to be barred off from the others in the mansion view, you can probably do so by probing the facing wall of an adjacent room. Unlike in the Goonies 2, the mansion in which the action takes place consists of a single building that contains all 20 or so of the rooms on 3 floors, plus a small outbuilding. The mansion view initially gives the impression of a very dense, suffocating sort of action game. Since you don't have much space to explore while bats and mice spawn endlessly to annoy you. The adventure scenes contain the meat of the game. Not only do they allow you to acquire weapons to augment your crummy pocket knife, one of the least effective weapons yet seen on NES, they also contain entrances to the secret zones where the main action takes place. Michael Chaos has come to the mansion in order to rescue his better-educated brother, the eponymous Dr. Chaos, who has become trapped in a bizarre otherworldly space. In order to effect this rescue, Michael Chaos needs to defeat nearly a dozen bosses that have stolen pieces of a dismantled laser weapon. The structure of the game has a surprisingly open nature. If you can find the hidden entrance to a zone, you can enter that zone, whether or not you currently have the power and endurance to survive it. You can even do like I did and saw your way through the brutal final zone entirely too early, only to discover that the final boss won't engage you in battle until you've defeated all of his underlings. The game is pretty clear about your chances though. Zones beyond your capabilities are pretty quick to kill you. Then again, zones within your capabilities also waste no time wiping you out. Dr. Chaos may not be a pure horror game, but it certainly has a survival horror personality. You always enter every situation underarmed and overmatched, and weapons capable of evening the odds appear in scarce quantities. A big part of the difficulty comes from the fact that enemies don't drop items. You can only refill your health and stock up on ammo by poking around adventure scenes. A bigger part of the difficulty comes from the fact that enemies appear constantly and move in ways that make them nearly impossible to hit without taking damage or expending precious ammo. Bosses beyond the very first one practically demand you conserve gun ammo to use against them, moving in quick, erratic patterns, or unleashing barrages of firepower that will wipe you out in an instant. Even using cheat codes to minimize damage like I did here leaves you largely outgunned, especially in the underwater stages where tiny enemies with tinier hitboxes zip around as you move slowly in moon gravity. It also doesn't help that most level designs consist of frustrating platforming challenges where enemies can spawn without warning and knock you down to a lower level, forcing you to fight your way back to the top. It reminds me a bit of some of the boss encounters in the Wario Land games, except that instead of being limited to boss encounters, this style is baked into every stage of the game. There is no universe in which I could call Dr. Chaos a good game or a fun game, but it comes close enough in places that you can imagine how a modern-day remake could work. Make it less punitive, improve the controls and visuals and combat mechanics, and play up the creepiness to make it more of an authentic horror title, and you'd have something pretty great on your hands. Instead, this game enters the pantheon of NES titles with great intentions and weak execution. Another to file away with Karnov, Jaws, Golgo 13, or Rambo, though honestly with a greater emphasis on weak execution than any of those others. In the comics and movies, Superman is more or less impossible to defeat. But that's only because the bad guys never take aim at his weak point, video games. I haven't really talked much about this facet of NES history, but Nintendo promoted its official seal of quality concept pretty hard back in the day. After implementing a licensing system for the NES, Nintendo set up an approvals process that required publishers to submit games for concept approval. To hear them tell it, this process served as a filter to prevent unworthy games from reaching the US. And there seems to be some truth to this. While the NES library certainly had its share of crap games, it ultimately lacked the sort of ultra bottom-end material that appeared in the worst corners of the Famicom library, where Nintendo had less direct control. The Famicom library went on to include nearly twice as many games as were released on the American NES, and you'd better believe that not all of those games were winners. This process also fueled the fandom myth that Howard Phillips, who played a leading role in these evaluations, personally and single-handedly determined every game that reached the US or didn't. Really though, the seal of quality simply meant that a publisher had put together a game within the bounds of Nintendo's rules. They paid their licensing fees, passed concept approval, allowed Nintendo to manufacture the cartridges in first-party factories, and abided by the laws that Nintendo set up for retail. When games began to appear in the US from publishers who didn't want to play ball with Nintendo, such as Tengen and Color Dreams, Nintendo pushed the seal of quality as a guarantee of excellence. Those other guys didn't pass muster, they said, and their games are rotten. Not like the incredible games that bear the Nintendo seal of quality. This makes for a fine story until you start comparing games like Kemco's Superman to, say, Tengen's Rolling Thunder. The latter is a solid action title developed by Namco. The former is quite simply the worst game to have appeared on NES to this point. Superman makes Ghostbusters look like Super Mario Bros. 2. It makes chubby Cherub look like Mega Man 3. Superman is god-awful. That's not great news for Kemco, who recently debuted on NES with a mediocre port of First Star Software's Spy vs. Spy. Superman manages to plunge far below that iffy bar of quality and scrape at the basement of video gaming, like its heroic namesake, drilling his body into the earth to create a tunnel leading to the world's biggest coprolite. Curiously, Superman also bears the First Star Software logo, but unlike Spy vs. Spy, this NES game bears zero resemblance to that other company's computer title. First Star Software's Superman on Commodore 64 was an odd little single-screen arcade-style game in which Superman and Darkseid exchanged beams of heat vision and anti-life equation or whatever in a cityscape where they had to adjust mirrors to direct their shots at one another. Superman on NES does none of that. On the contrary, it's somewhat analogous to a Metroidvania, or perhaps it should be called a Metropolisvania. I can only guess that Kemco sub-licensed the Superman property from First Star or something, and then developed their own original work instead of porting the existing game. I almost wish they'd gone the conversion route, because what they put together really delegitimizes the concept of a seal of quality. You play as Clark Kent, aka Superman, attempting to put a stop to the schemes of both Lex Luthor and General Zod all at once in a sort of open-worldish take on Metropolis. Metropolis consists of many screens of cityscape linked together by direct connection and via subway, and most screens contain entrances to either building interiors or subway stations. You'll find different missions around the city dispensed by familiar NPCs like Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane, and Perry White, who have a strange tendency to hang out together even outside the office. The ingredients for a very good take on the Superman concept exist here. Sadly, those ingredients do not gel. If Superman for NES were a souffle, not only would it not have risen properly, it would have collapsed so hard that its plummet would have smashed through the bottom of the oven and killed a family of 5 living in the apartment below. The team that put this game together managed to miss the mark in every possible respect. Superman fails on a technical level, with unattractive graphics that move at an aggressively low frame rate. It also offends on a game design level. From the fact that you press up to jump so that the B button can be reserved for activating Superman's powers, to the fact that power-up icons released by enemies always fly out of their defeated corpses by arcing up to the right and then dropping off the screen if you fail to catch them. And that's to say nothing of the limitations it imposes on the Man of Steel himself. The game treats Superman and Clark Kent as 2 separate entities. The former can get around more quickly than the latter, and can use superpowers. But you need to keep your health above the 25% mark in order to maintain your super form. If the health meter drops below that, Superman reverts to Clark and can't transform back until he collects enough blue kryptonite to boost his stamina. Enemies seem to have about a 1 in 10 chance of dropping health boosts, with a 90% chance of dropping a superpower boost, dangerous red or green kryptonite, or most likely nothing. This makes the process of restoring your power once reduced to your more vulnerable form incredibly difficult. In other words, Superman suffers from the same punitive design flaw as Blaster Master's gun degradation, while offering none of Blaster Master's strengths and balance. It's a damn shame because, again, you can see the potential here for a legitimately good game. Superman's powers, while curiously limited by energy meters, work to great effect. You need to use his super breath to freeze zombies, and his X-ray vision to reveal invisible enemies. The city of Metropolis spans a huge area and contains the framework for the sort of rollicking adventure that Technos would eventually deliver with River City Ransom. The quest objective system and the use of items like subway passes to gate progression through the city promises a great Metroidvania-like journey. This journey is not one you want to take. In more capable hands, Superman could have been amazing, or at least a weirdly ambitious mess like RAMBO or Golgo 13. Instead, it's just a mess, pure and simple. One worse than Dr. Chaos. A mess that makes you wish that Nintendo had denied it the seal of quality and sealed it in the Phantom Zone instead. As for the now standard question of what did Nintendo Power say? These games, not a lot. Both showed up as perfunctory preview blurbs, and the tips section of Issue 6 explained where to find the special sensor that allows you to travel into Dr. Chaos's action zones. This is literally the first thing you need to do in Dr. Chaos. The task you need to accomplish before the game opens up to contain anything more than a single house with a bunch of rooms. Which says a lot about Dr. Chaos's accessibility. But otherwise, the editorial team felt that there were better games to cover with those precious inches of copy. Interestingly, it looks like Game Player magazine devoted the most space to Dr. Chaos, offering full maps and breakdowns. Doing what Nintendo Power didn't, I guess. Anyway, Nintendo's magazine had the right idea. While somewhat interesting, neither of these games really merits exhaustive coverage, or an extensive investment of time. Next time on NES Works,